You Can't Go Home Again. That is the title of a 1940 novel by Thomas Wolfe. And in the novel, it tells a story of a young man who was raised in a small town in North Carolina, and he's an author. And he leaves his small town in North Carolina to go to New York and write his first novel. And he's successful with writing that novel, becomes famous. But then he goes back to his hometown, and the people there are angry with him because he wrote the novel as a sort of a story of his growing up in this small town in North Carolina. And the people of the town don't like how he portrayed them in the town. And so they're angry with him, and he ends up having to leave town. They look at him and they say that he's changed. He's not the same person that he was. And he goes back and looks at his hometown differently than he looked at it before he left. Thus the title of the novel, You Can't Go Home Again. We are in Mark chapter 6 this morning. And Mark chapter 6 verses 1 through 6 tell us the short story of how Jesus went home to his hometown of Nazareth, and how the people there rejected him. So that's the connection of not being able to go home again. So if you'd like to look with me at Mark chapter 6 verses 1 through 6, we'll read that together. Jesus left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue. Many who heard him were surprised. Where did this man get all this? What's this wisdom he's been given? What about the powerful acts accomplished through him? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't he Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us? They were repulsed by him and fell into sin. Jesus said to them, prophets are honored everywhere except in their hometowns, among their relatives, and in their own households. He was unable to do any miracles there except that he placed his hands on a few sick people and healed them. He was appalled by their disbelief. Jesus has been traveling about the region. Again, he's been in Capernaum. He's been to the lake, on both sides of the lake, across the lake, up and down a mountain, and now he goes back to his hometown. And when he gets there to Nazareth, his hometown, the place where he was raised, the response of the people is one of surprise. It's not necessarily a negative response. In verse 2, we see that when he began to teach in the synagogue, they were surprised, and they expressed their surprise by asking three questions. First of all, where did this man get all this? Second, what's this wisdom that he's been given? And then the third, what about the powerful acts accomplished through him? They recognize something special is happening with this man, Jesus, the one who grew up in their small town of Nazareth. They recognize that he has been given something unique. They describe the wisdom as something that's been given to him, not something that he's gone out and discovered or achieved on his own. Similar, I think, to what we might notice when a young child makes some kind of an observation, scientific or intellectual, that you don't expect a young child to make, and you say, who told you that? Where did you get that wisdom? Jesus is speaking words that people recognize couldn't have come from this Jesus that they knew growing up. So also, as he's been traveling around the region, they've heard about and probably some witnessed with their own eyes these marvelous acts, these miraculous acts that Jesus has been performing. They realize that an ordinary man doesn't just do these things. Something has been given to him. this initial reaction in Nazareth is similar to the first reaction that the people in Capernaum had to Jesus when he first started to teach in their synagogue. If you jump back to Mark chapter 1, starting in verse 21, this is after Jesus is baptized and begins announcing the arrival of God's reign on earth. He says in Mark 1:21 that Jesus and his followers went into Capernaum. Immediately on the Sabbath, Jesus entered the synagogue and started teaching. And the people there were amazed by his teaching, for he was teaching them with authority, not like the legal experts. So Jesus was bringing some new authority to his teaching that the people didn't recognize, but they recognized that it was authority with which he was speaking. Mark tells us about how Jesus in that synagogue cast an evil spirit out of a man, and everybody is surprised by that. And then in verse 27 of chapter 1, it continues, everyone was shaken and questioned among themselves, what's this? A new teaching with authority. He even commands unclean spirits, and they obey him. So this initial encounter with Jesus in Capernaum, and then also in his hometown of Nazareth, is one of surprise. People are surprised by this wisdom and these abilities that this man Jesus has, and are wondering, where did it come from? Now, we're reading the gospel. We as readers of Mark's telling of the life of Jesus, telling the story of the life of Jesus, we know where it comes from, right? We know that the wisdom and the power, these abilities come from God. But the people that Jesus encountered there in Nazareth are surprised and wondering what's happened. This Jesus who has come back to his hometown is not the same man who left not too long ago. Now, their surprise, which might be thought of as positive or neutrally, turns negative because they are soon repulsed by Jesus. The word repulsed here in the translation that we see in verse 3, in Mark's Greek, it's the word from which we get in English the word scandalized. To be scandalized. Elsewhere, Jesus uses this word when he talks about if your right hand causes you to sin, or if your eye causes you to sin. That's the word that gets used here. The noun form of the word gets used at multiple places in the New Testament, and it's translated as a stumbling block. Again, something that catches people and they stumble over. And so, something about Jesus is a scandal to the people. They can't accept it. And it causes them to sin, in Mark's words, using this word. They are repulsed by Jesus. We have a saying that familiarity brings contempt, right? The people that we know the best are the people whose weaknesses we know the best. When you get to know a person, the more you get to know them, the more sometimes we tend to focus on the things that bother us about them, their flaws. Familiarity brings contempt. And the people express their familiarity and their contempt for Jesus with three more questions in verse 3 here. Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't he Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? And aren't his sisters here with us? What does this tell us about Jesus? I think one thing it tells us that Jesus' childhood and his early adulthood were quite unspectacular. He didn't do anything necessarily to stand out in his small town growing up or as a young man. He was just Jesus, the son of Mary, the son of Joseph. Mark doesn't mention Joseph here, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Explanations possible. We don't know why Mark doesn't mention Joseph. It could be that Joseph had died, and so they just call him the son of Mary. It could be because Nazareth was Mary's hometown, where she grew up, not where Joseph grew up, and so the hometown knows Jesus the son by his mother because he's the one that they knew, so Jesus the son of Mary. And it could also be Mark's way of reminding us that Jesus is not Joseph's son. He's Mary's son, but not Joseph's son. He's God's son. But regardless to the people, he's simply Jesus, the son of Mary, the one that they watched grow up in their small town, the one that they all knew that did nothing to stand out. The only story we have from Jesus' childhood comes from Luke. You remember when Luke was 12 years old, the family went to Jerusalem for the Passover feast, and Mary and Joseph lost track of Jesus, traveled for a couple days, realized all of a sudden they don't have him, so they go back. And remember, Jesus is there with these older men, asking them questions, and he's amazing them all. And then Joseph and Mary are surprised too. On the one hand, we have this insight, wow, Jesus is special. He does have special insight. But Joseph and Mary are surprised. They didn't say, yeah, he's a pretty smart kid. We knew this. They're shocked. Jesus, the child, the young man, did nothing to stand out for people. One thing that tells us, though, also is that something happened at Jesus' baptism. As Christians, we confess that Jesus is fully human and fully divine from his very conception. But we also, when we read the story, when we encounter Jesus in all four Gospels, we see that when Jesus was baptized and the Spirit came on him, something changed drastically about Jesus internally. And the whole direction of his life changed as well. And so when this Jesus that grew up in this little town, this one of the kids in town, one of the young men in town who grew up being a builder, leaves and then comes back a short time later full of wisdom and power, they're repulsed by him because this is the Jesus that we know. He can't be doing these things. After the hometown crowd is surprised and repulsed by Jesus, we read two words that describe Jesus that we aren't used to using when we describe Jesus. And those two words are unable and appalled. How often do we talk about Jesus being unable? How often do we talk about Jesus being appalled? Those are the two words that Mark uses to describe Jesus' response to the response of his hometown when he came back to teach. Jesus begins with a little saying about prophets. He says, prophets are honored everywhere except in their own hometowns, among their relatives and their own households. I think this goes back on that little saying, that the truth of it about familiarity bringing contempt. And he brings up his own family, right? Not only are prophets not honored by their hometowns, but they don't have honor among their relatives in their own households. It's just back a couple chapters earlier in chapter 3 where we read that Jesus was in a house and he was teaching and there were crowds all around him. And it mentions that it was so crowded that he and his disciples couldn't even find something to eat. But Mark tells us that his family heard about him and they came to fetch him because they thought he'd gone out of his mind. So Jesus' own family, his mother, his brothers, and his sisters, says they thought he was out of his mind, and they came to get him for his own safety, to take care of him. So the prophet has no honor among his own family. The prophet has no honor among his own hometown. I think the rejection of Jesus in this little town of Nazareth foreshadows for us the rejection that Jesus, the embodiment of Yahweh, Israel's God, will experience when he returns to Jerusalem. Remember the promises that the prophets make about Yahweh returning to Jerusalem, returning to restore his people. And so when Jesus returns to Jerusalem as the embodiment of Israel's God, Yahweh, the hometown, Jerusalem, rejects him. There's also a glimmer of hope there as well, though, is because as Mark lists off the brothers of Jesus and his mother, we're reminded that Mary was present at the cross when Jesus died. And the brothers of Jesus, two of them, James and Judas, we learn later became leaders in the church and wrote what we call books or letters that ended up in our New Testament, the books of James and Jude. So while they were initially skeptical or perhaps repulsed by Jesus, they did come to believe, put their trust in him for who he was. But let's talk again about Jesus. Jesus, it says, was unable to do any miracles there. Just in the last chapter, Mark chapter 5, we read about two people trusting Jesus. Last week we read about Jairus trusting Jesus, and then the woman who had been bleeding trusting Jesus. And so their trust in Jesus brought them to Jesus to ask for help. And so their trust put them in a position so that Jesus helped them. When we read Mark, we don't see Jesus going out and finding people who needed his help and saying, "Here, I'm going to help you." What we read about is people trusting Jesus, coming to Jesus in their need and asking Jesus to help. And so then Jesus is able to help them, to heal them, to cleanse them, to cast out demons because they've come to him. In his hometown, the people won't trust him and come to him for help, so he is unable to do any miracles, unable to help them. And then also he is appalled, amazed by their disbelief. And there again is that relationship between trust and miracles that Mark talks about. People putting their trust in God. The relationship between trust and the message, the good news of the reign of God coming. The requirement that people change their lives and put their trust in the good news. Jesus comes and he teaches, he speaks the good news, he brings wisdom from God, and he performs mighty acts for everyone to see, but the people won't see him for who he is. Why couldn't they see him? Why couldn't the people of Nazareth see Jesus for who he was? There is a song, someone might accuse me of thinking that they stopped making good music in the 90s, and it might be about true for my opinion. But from 1995, there is a song sung by Joan Osborne, and the title of the song is "One of Us." The chorus of the song goes like this. It might be familiar to you. What if God was one of us? Just a slob like one of us? Just a stranger on the bus trying to find his way home? Just another person. When God came to earth to bring salvation to all the earth, he did it by taking the form of an average man in a small, forgotten town. No fanfare, no majesty. In fact, when we read about the birth of Jesus, the only fanfare or big announcements we get are when the angels appear to the shepherds outside of town. Jesus came in humility and servitude and was missed. I'm reminded of Isaiah 53, 1 and 2. Who can believe what we've heard, and for whose sake has the Lord's arm been revealed? He grew up like a young plant before us, like a root from dry ground. He possessed no splendid form for us to see, no desirable appearance. Jesus was missed because of his plainness, his humility. The second verse of the song, "One of Us," is also a powerful statement. If God had a face, what would it look like? And would you want to see it if seeing meant that you would have to believe in things like heaven and in Jesus and in the saints and all the prophets? Seeing God's face, seeing Jesus for who he is a little bit dangerous. It can be costly, because doing so might require us to give up what we think God is supposed to look like, what Jesus is supposed to be like. Why were the people in Jesus' time, in his hometown and elsewhere, blinded to who he was? What were they expecting to see in God and God's reign and God's Messiah? The message of liberation and salvation had become a message of victory over their Roman oppressors. They were looking for a Davidic, military, violent king to save them. But Jesus again came in humility, casting out demons, healing, forgiving, speaking words of love, freeing them from the true oppressors. They couldn't see it. What they saw didn't match up with the expectations. And they weren't willing to give up those expectations. And they missed. They rejected Jesus when he came home. I worry about us as Christians in America and worldwide, as we have a tendency, as people have to do, to try to envision and make God what we expect God to be. Make God conform to our social values, our cultural values, our political ideals, and even our own religious systems. Are we willing to see God? And when we see God through Jesus, through the Scriptures, are we willing to set aside what we think Jesus is supposed to look like, what God is supposed to be like? What if God was one of us? What if God has a face? What would it look like? Are we willing to look to Jesus to discover that, setting aside our own preconceptions, our own notions, our own biases, and see and accept? Jesus' hometown didn't recognize him when he returned. Can't go home again. Will we be ready? Will we recognize Jesus when he returns? Let's pray together. Lord, you have made yourself known to us in many ways. We have the Scriptures, the words of Moses, the words of the prophets. We have the Gospels. We have letters to learn about who you are, what you look like. Please open our eyes. Give us humility. Give us insight so that we can see, so that we can accept, and so that we can be trusting and be changed by who you are and what you are doing. We are grateful, Lord, for Jesus, for coming to this earth, and for the encounters that we can share with people that are brought to us and have been preserved through the words of Mark. Again, thank you, and strengthen us and change us through your Spirit, O Lord. And it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.